The sun rose slowly over the Virginia countryside, brushing the hills with gold. Morning mist clung to the valley below Fort Stillman, where the rumble of training vehicles echoed faintly through the pines. On the far edge of the base, where the grass met the woods, sat an old wooden cabin known as the Hilltop House. It wasn't glamorous, just a converted barracks with a few rooms and a fenced yard, but inside, laughter filled the air. Megan Carter wiped her hands on a towel, glancing around the small playroom. 6 toddlers tumbled across the carpet, their giggles mixing with the sound of a battery-powered Jeep toy bouncing against the wall. She smiled. "Careful, Tyler. We don't want another crash landing today." Tyler, the colonel's son, grinned up at her, his cheeks streaked with finger paint. Megan chuckled softly and crouched beside him, adjusting the toy's steering wheel. She was 24, with auburn hair tied neatly in a bun and a calm, steady presence that made both children and soldiers trust her instantly. Officially, she worked as a part-time caretaker at the base's family center, filling in for mothers and fathers who were deployed or training. Unofficially, most people called her the babysitter on the hill. Some said it kindly. Others said it with a smirk. Megan had learned not to care. She had once dreamed of joining the army full-time, but life had shifted. Her mother's health failed, her younger brother enlisted, and Megan stayed close to home. Still, she volunteered with the National Guard when she could, training on weekends and assisting with emergency response drills. Her file was full of commendable remarks, but no one ever imagined she'd be called into action beyond helping with first aid at community fairs. The Hilltop House, where she now stood, overlooked miles of dense forest and ridgelines, a quiet place away from the main command center. To Megan, it was both peaceful and lonely. At noon, the children's parents arrived to pick them up one by one. Megan waved them off, cleaned the room, and sat outside on the porch with a cup of coffee. The wind was warm, the kind that carried the scent of pine and dust. From where she sat, she could see smoke curling faintly from the far horizon. She frowned. That's not training smoke. A few seconds later, her radio crackled to life. "Control to all units. Report status. Fire has breached perimeter on Sector 7. Repeat, wildfire approaching from North Ridge." Her heart tightened. Sector 7 was near the training grounds. She stood, scanning the ridges through binoculars. Flames shimmered like orange threads in the distance. A sudden gust scattered sparks into the air. The forest was dry from weeks without rain. One wrong wind, and the entire slope could ignite. The radio came alive again. "This is Echo Squad. We're cut off. Repeat, or trapped on the North Ridge. Fire jumped the ravine. We're losing visibility. Request immediate evac." Static followed. Then silence. Megan froze. Echo Squad was a small National Guard unit conducting weekend field training on those very ridges she had waved them goodbye 2 days ago when they'd passed by her hill. She adjusted the radio, cycling through frequencies. "Echo Squad, this is Hilltop Base. Come in." Nothing. "Control, do you read?" Still nothing, but crackling static. The main lines must have gone down. The fire was interfering with communication. She felt a sudden, sharp pulse of panic. The emergency units were already stretched thin fighting fires closer to the towns. If no one picked up that distress call, those soldiers could die within the hour. Megan stared at the smoke thickening across the hills. The easy choice would be to stay put, lock the doors, and wait for orders. She wasn't combat personnel. Her role was to keep children safe, not charge into a wildfire. But something inside her, an old, familiar defiance, rose up. Her father's voice echoed in memory. "Courage isn't loud, Megan. It's quiet. It's when nobody else moves, and you do." She looked back toward the empty playroom, the tiny chairs, the stuffed bears, the half-done crayon drawings pinned to the wall. One of them showed a stick-figure woman holding a flag. Tyler had written beneath it in crooked letters, "Miss Megan, the strongest soldier." She closed her eyes, exhaled, and whispered, "All right, Dad. Guess it's time." Inside, she opened the emergency cabinet and pulled out the old field medic kit she'd kept from her training days. It wasn't much bandages, painkillers, a flare gun, a thermal blanket, but it was better than nothing. She grabbed her small pack, filled it with bottled water and a map, and slung it over her shoulder. Outside, the wind was stronger now, bending the treetops. Her pickup truck sat at the edge of the gravel road, coated in dust. She threw open the door, started the engine, and flipped on the emergency lights. "Control, this is Hilltop House," she said into the radio, hoping anyone could hear. "I'm heading toward the North Ridge to assist Echo Squad. If you get this, send backup." No reply. She shifted into gear and began the climb. The road was narrow, twisting between trees that were already catching embers. She drove fast but careful, windows cracked to keep from fogging. Her heart hammered. The higher she went, the thicker the smoke became, turning the sky from blue to copper. Halfway up, she saw movement ahead, a convoy of firefighters heading down. One man waved her to stop. "Ma'am, you can't go up there. The fire's cutting through both flanks." He shouted. "I have soldiers trapped up there," Megan yelled back. "Echo Squad, they called for evac." He hesitated, glancing at the smoke. "We haven't had any word about survivors on that ridge. It's suicide. Then let me try before it becomes a recovery mission." Something in her eyes, steady, fierce, determined, made him pause. He finally nodded, tossing her a small oxygen mask from his truck. "If you're going, take this. And for God's sake, stay low." She slipped it on, nodded, and pressed forward. The road ended where the forest began. Ahead, flames licked across fallen logs, heat rippling in waves. She parked the truck, grabbed her bag, and stepped out. The ground crackled beneath her boots. Ash swirled around her face like gray snow. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but she forced one step forward, then another. The wind roared behind her, pushing smoke uphill. Her radio buzzed again, just a flicker of sound. ... Echo Squad. Trapped ... Northwest Ridge ... Megan adjusted her compass, squinting through the haze. Northwest Ridge was roughly 2 miles ahead, but the terrain was steep and uneven. She muttered, "All right, boys. Hang on." She tied a wet cloth over her mouth, ducked low, and began climbing into the heart of the fire zone. Behind her, the Hilltop House stood silent, empty, except for the faint smell of crayons and coffee. No one at the base knew she was gone. No one knew that the woman they'd called just a babysitter was walking straight into the flames. And as the first ember burned through her sleeve, Megan Carter's quiet life on the hill ended, and the legend of the babysitter on the hill began. The smoke had settled slightly over the valley, but the smell of burning pine lingered in every corner of Megan Carter's lungs. Her boots were caked with ash, her gloves singed, and yet she moved with a precision and calm that belied the chaos around her. The 4 soldiers she had stumbled upon, Corporal Jenkins, Sergeant Alvarez, Private Dorsey, and Specialist Lee, followed her lead, but the fear in their eyes was palpable. Megan had become their lifeline, a civilian babysitter thrust into the impossible. The fire had started hours earlier, a rogue lightning strike deep in the forest. By the time Megan had found the soldiers, the flames had already swallowed the lower ridges, turning the valley into a furnace. Trees cracked and fell like thunderclaps, and embers danced on the wind like sparks from an inferno lantern. She had no time to think, only to act. "Move!" she shouted, pointing toward a jagged incline. The soldiers hesitated, weighing their fear against the urgency in her voice. Megan didn't wait for permission. She sprinted up the slope, helping each of them over fallen trees and rocks. Dorsey's leg scraped against a sharp branch, and he cried out in pain. Megan turned, grasped his arm, and pulled him up. "We don't have time to stop. We can't let the fire trap us down there." Alvarez gritted his teeth, splinting his arm as best as he could while climbing. "You're insane, Carter. This isn't your fight." "It is my fight now." She shot back. "Stay with me, or you won't have a tomorrow to fight in at all." The words rang harshly over the roar of the fire, but they cut through their panic. The soldiers quickened their pace, driven by sheer survival instinct and the force of her determination. As they climbed, Megan scanned the ridge for anything useful. The trees were scarred, some reduced to blackened stumps. Birds fled overhead, cawing in panic, and small animals darted in every direction. It was as though the forest itself had become a living threat. She knew the fire could circle them in minutes if the wind shifted again. Halfway up, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. Below, the flames raged like molten rivers. Megan could see the valley beyond, but it offered no comfort. The fire had cut off all paths down. The only way out was forward and upward. Jenkins shook his head. "This is suicide." "No," Megan said, her voice calm but fierce. "This is survival." She turned to Dorsey. "Tie that rope around your waist. Lee, grab the other end. We'll use it to stabilize you as you climb this section." The soldiers obeyed, the tension between fear and hope palpable in the tight lines of their faces. Megan led the way, moving carefully along the ledge. Sparks showered past them from burning branches above, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Every step had to be deliberate. One misstep, and the fall would be fatal. As they climbed, Megan kept shouting instructions, her voice slicing through the roar of the inferno. "Foot here. Grab that root. Keep your center of gravity low." Despite their exhaustion, the soldiers moved as best they could, trusting her judgment. Megan's hands were blistered and raw, but she didn't stop to tend them. There was no time. Every second counted. Suddenly, a branch cracked above them, sending a cascade of sparks down the slope. Dorsey froze. Megan lunged, pushing him to the side just as the embers skittered past. He coughed violently, choking on the smoke. "It's okay. Breathe through your shirt," she instructed, tearing a strip of her own sleeve to make a makeshift mask for him. Minutes turned into hours as they navigated the treacherous ridge. Megan kept them moving, rationing their energy, coaxing them over difficult stretches. Lee's boots slipped once on loose rock, sending her heart into her throat. Megan grabbed the young soldier's arm and pulled her to safety, her muscles screaming from strain. Finally, they reached a slightly more stable plateau. The soldiers collapsed, gasping, but Megan refused to sit. She scanned the ridge ahead, calculating their next move. "We can't stop for long," she said. "We need to reach the next rise. If we get high enough, maybe we can signal a helicopter. Maybe someone can see us before this fire closes the circle completely." Alvarez groaned. "You think anyone's looking for us? We're out here like ants on a matchstick." "I don't care," Megan said, her voice unwavering. "We're going to make them see us." Her determination sparked something in the soldiers. They stood, grim-faced, but moving with renewed energy. Together, they advanced, using ropes, roots, and sheer willpower to climb higher. At one point, Jenkins's foot slipped on a charred rock. He screamed, but Megan was already there, grabbing his hand and yanking him to safety. "You okay?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "Yeah," he muttered, though his shaking hands betrayed him. "You'll be fine. Just keep going." "We're almost there," Megan reassured him. The fire shifted with the wind, sending waves of heat across their backs. Sparks rained down, and the smell of smoke was suffocating. Megan felt every muscle in her body screaming in protest, every ounce of strength tested. But she didn't stop. Not for a moment. The lives of these men were in her hands, and she refused to fail. By late afternoon, they reached a ledge that overlooked a valley still partially untouched by fire. Megan could see a patch of open sky, the perfect place to signal for help. "Here," she said, collapsing onto the rocks, her face streaked with soot. "This is it. We have to signal the helicopters from here. Someone's out there. We'll make them see us." Dorsey coughed violently, his face blackened with ash. "And if they don't?" "They will," Megan said, more to convince herself than him. "We'll make sure they do. We survive by refusing to give up." They rested just long enough to catch their breath. Megan tore strips of cloth from her own clothing and instructed the soldiers to tie them to rocks, waving them like banners. Sparks and smoke could be seen from far away, and if anyone was looking, it would stand out against the ridge. She pulled out her small signal mirror, a tool she had trained with in preparation for emergencies, and caught the last rays of the sun. "Flash with me," she instructed. "We'll send a signal through the smoke. Someone has to see this." The soldiers joined her, and together they flashed the mirrors in synchronized rhythm. Sparks from the burning ridge danced in the fading light, and the smoke twisted in the wind, rising like a living thing. Hours passed. The soldiers rested when they could, trusting Megan to watch, to plan, to act. She never left their side, never allowed panic to creep in. She was their anchor, their guiding light in the middle of chaos. By the time darkness began to settle, Megan knew they had reached a critical point. They were high enough that anyone patrolling the area, helicopter, ranger, or rescue team, would be able to see their signal. But the danger was far from over. The fire below still roared, hungry and unrelenting. The ridge behind them smoldered, threatening to cut off their path. Megan knew that the next steps would be even more dangerous, climbing higher into thinner air, across more treacherous rocks, with nothing but sheer determination and courage guiding them. Yet despite exhaustion, pain, and the fear gnawing at the edges of their minds, she felt something else. Hope. Hope that they would survive. Hope that someone would see them. Hope that courage, no matter how small, could still make a difference in the face of destruction. She looked at the 4 soldiers surrounding her. Their faces were grim, blackened, and weary, but they were alive. Alive because she had refused to leave them. Alive because, in a world consumed by fire, she had chosen to stay. And in that moment, Megan Carter, the so-called babysitter on the hill, understood something profound. Sometimes, ordinary people are forced into extraordinary roles. Sometimes, survival is about more than just escaping danger. Sometimes it is about standing firm, guiding others, and refusing to give up, no matter how impossible the odds. The night settled over the ridge. The fire glowed below, distant but terrifying. And still, Megan's resolve burned brighter than any flame. The smoke thickened like storm clouds around her, turning daylight into an eerie twilight. The oxygen mask pressed against her face, damp with sweat. Megan Carter moved carefully, boots crunching over charred leaves. Every few steps, she paused to listen above the constant roar of burning trees. She could faintly hear something else. Voices, coughing, maybe even shouting. Her heart leaped. "Echo Squad?" She yelled, pulling the mask aside for a moment. "Can anyone hear me?" Only the wind answered, carrying the crackle of falling branches. She moved toward the sound, guided by instinct more than sight. The fire had carved a monstrous path through the ridge-blackened trunks, glowing roots, and ash swirling like ghosts. The air was so thick it burned her lungs even through the mask. Then, through the haze, she saw movement. A soldier staggered into view, uniform scorched, one arm limp at his side. His face was streaked with soot. He looked more like a shadow than a man. Megan sprinted toward him. "Hey, I've got you, come on." He turned, blinking in confusion. Who are you?" "Doesn't matter." "Can you walk?" He coughed violently, shaking his head. I think my arm's broken." "The others?" "They're still down there." Fire jumped the trench. Megan guided him down to a rock outcrop, scanning the ridge below. Through gaps in the smoke, she could make out flashes of movement helmets glinting faintly. There had to be 4 or 5 of them. She knelt beside the wounded man, cutting open his sleeve with her pocket knife. The arm was badly burned and swollen. She splinted it quickly with a stick and bandage. "What's your name, soldier?" "Corporal Jenkins," he rasped. "Well, Jenkins, we're getting you and your friends out of here. Can you hold this mask on your face?" He nodded weakly. Megan stood, her body screaming from exhaustion. Her throat felt like sandpaper. The heat was unbearable. Waves of it rolled through the trees, warping the air. But she pushed forward. Halfway down the slope, the forest floor exploded with sound, a burst of popping, sharp and rhythmic. She dove behind a log before realizing it wasn't gunfire. Ammunition. The squad's spare rounds were cooking off in the heat. "Damn it," she whispered. She had to get there fast, before something detonated. The ground was uneven, and every step sent cinders into her boots. She could feel blisters forming on her feet. But then through the chaos, she spotted them. 2 soldiers huddled behind a boulder, one slumped against the other. Their rifles lay melted nearby. "Hey!" she shouted, waving her arms. One of them looked up, eyes red and glassy. Who the hell are you?" "Rescue team," she said without hesitation. "We're getting you out." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. "You came alone?" "Not if you count the fire," she said dryly. "Can he move?" The conscious soldier, Sergeant Alvarez, nodded toward his unconscious teammate. Smoke inhalation. "He's fading fast." Megan dropped beside them, checking the pulse. Weak, but there. She tore open a water bottle, poured some over a cloth, and pressed it to his mouth and nose. "Breathe slow. Don't talk." Alvarez blinked at her in disbelief. You're not even part of our unit, are you?" "Nope, babysitter on the hill." He stared at her for a moment. Then, despite everything, a small grin cracked through the soot. "Hell of a babysitter." The forest answered with a thunderous crack as a tree split and crashed nearby, sending sparks raining over them. Megan flinched, pulling the wounded man closer. "We need higher ground," she said, scanning the terrain. "If we stay here, the fire will close in." "The comms are fried," Alvarez said. "No signal, no GPS. We're blind. Then we make our own path." She tore a strip from her shirt, soaked it, and tied it around her mouth. "You grab his shoulders. I'll take his legs." Together, they lifted the unconscious soldier, staggering uphill. The flames behind them hissed like an angry tide. Megan's vision blurred with sweat and smoke. Her arms burned from the strain, but she refused to stop. Every few steps, she heard the crackle of branches, the groan of collapsing trees. The world around them was collapsing into ash and heat. But ahead through the chaos, she spotted a faint shimmer of light. A small clearing. They reached it just as Megan's knees buckled. She dropped beside a half-burned log, panting. The unconscious soldier still wasn't moving. She reached for her radio, flicking through channels. Static, then barely audible. Echo, survivors. Ridge line. It was a fragment, but it was enough. Someone, somewhere, was still trying to reach them. She pressed the button. This is Hilltop Base Volunteer 3 survivors, located near North Ridge. Fire advancing. Request evac coordinates. Static. No response. Megan slammed the radio against the rock in frustration. Come on. Alvarez looked at her, defeated. They can't hear us. Then we make them. She tore a flare from her kit, cracked it open, and waved it toward the sky. The red light burned bright against the gray smoke, but only for a few seconds before disappearing into the haze. No choppers. No voices. Just silence. Jenkins stumbled into view then, clutching his broken arm, eyes wide. You found them. Yeah, she said, forcing a small smile. And we're finding the rest. Alvarez frowned. There is no rest. There were 5 of us. One's missing. Then he's still out there, Megan said, already on her feet. She grabbed her bag, refilled the bandages, and looked toward the burning ridge. The smoke seemed endless, curling like black serpents around the trees. But she wasn't done, not yet. Behind her, Alvarez called out, You go in there. You won't come back. She turned, her expression calm but fierce. You think I came this far to stop now? And with that, she stepped back into the inferno. The heat was unbearable, now like standing inside a furnace. Every breath felt like inhaling knives. But she moved forward, crouching low, sweeping her flashlight across the ground. Charred footprints. A torn patch of camouflage. Then movement. A man lay half buried under fallen branches, his leg pinned by a burning log. Megan dropped to her knees, grabbed a branch, and used her weight to lever it off him. The soldier screamed, the sound raw and terrible. I know, hang on. She shouted, pulling him free. His pants were burned through, skin blistered and red. She doused the wound with water, then wrapped it tight. When she finally got him sitting up, he stared at her, dazed. Who are you? She smiled weakly. The babysitter. Don't ask. He laughed once, then coughed hard. I thought we were dead. Not today, she said. But we will be if we don't move. By the time they returned to the clearing, the others had managed to prop up the unconscious soldier. The circle was complete, all 4 members of Echo Squad alive, though barely. Megan dropped to the ground beside them, chest heaving. All right? We've got one chance. The wind's shifting. If we move east, there's a rock formation that might block some of the flames. Alvarez shook his head. That's a 2-mile climb. Then start walking, she said. Because if we stay, we're kindling. He hesitated, then nodded. You heard the babysitter, he said, forcing a grin. Jenkins laughed weakly. Ma'am, if we live through this, drinks are on me. Make it coffee, she said. I've had enough heat for one day. They began to move as one slow, limping, but together. Megan took the rear, guiding them through falling ash and collapsing trees. Behind them, the fire roared higher, a living wall of fury chasing them up the ridge. For hours, they fought upward, every breath a battle. When at last they reached the first rocks, Megan turned and looked back. The valley below glowed like molten gold, smoke billowing into the evening sky. They had survived the fire line barely. But she knew it wasn't over. Not until she found a way to signal the world that they were still alive. She checked her radio, again still dead. The batteries were hot to the touch. She looked at the battered men around her, then up toward the summit. Somewhere above those burning trees, there had to be a signal. And Megan Carter, babysitter, medic, hero, was going to find it. The smoke thinned for a moment as the wind shifted, revealing a faint slice of orange sun bleeding through the haze. Megan Carter collapsed against a rock, chest heaving, every breath scraping her throat raw. Behind her, the 4 survivors of Echo Squad slumped to the ground, coughing, bleeding, barely holding themselves upright. They had climbed for what felt like hours through smoldering brush, across ridges that glowed with buried embers, under skies the color of rust. Every part of her body burned, but she didn't dare stop for long. The fire was unpredictable. The flames below had quieted, but that only meant the wind was planning its next strike. Corporal Jenkins groaned, clutching his splinted arm. "Tell me we're done climbing." Megan shook her head, her voice hoarse. "We can't stop. The fire's circling east. If it meets the wind from the valley, it'll sweep up this ridge like gasoline." Sergeant Alvarez looked over the ledge and swore under his breath. Below them, the forest they had escaped from was now an ocean of flame, rolling across the trees in waves. The smoke formed pillars that reached for the sky. "Then where the hell do we go?" he said, wiping soot from his face. "Up," Megan replied simply. "If we get to the top, we might get a signal. Maybe even a view for a chopper to spot." The youngest of the group, Private Dorsey, the one she dragged out from under the burning log, stared at her in disbelief. "You want us to climb higher? We're already in hell." Megan's gaze softened. She crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I know, but if we stay here, hell comes to us. Up there, we've got a chance. That's all we need, one chance." Her calm steadiness, even in the middle of chaos, silenced the protest. The men exchanged weary glances, then nodded. "All right," Alvarez said finally. "Lead the way, Babysitter." Megan gave a half-smile. "Gladly." They pressed on. The ridge narrowed as they climbed, forcing them to move in single file. The terrain was jagged, broken by boulders and roots. Megan led, checking for stable ground. The heat radiated from the earth itself, and every gust of wind brought a fresh wave of sparks. The soldiers followed in grim silence, too exhausted to speak. Halfway up, a thunderous crack split the air. A burning pine tree snapped and fell across the path behind them, cutting off the slope they just climbed. Jenkins shouted, "That's our way down." Megan turned, eyes narrowing at the wall of fire now sealing their path. "Then down's not an option anymore." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time since she'd found them, fear flickered in their eyes, not panic, but that hollow realization that no one might come. They climbed faster after that, driven by instinct more than hope. The smoke thickened again, so dark it blotted out the sun. Megan's muscles screamed with every step. Her hands were blistered, her lips cracked. The mask she'd worn had melted slightly at the edges, filling her lungs with bitter ash. But still, she climbed. After another grueling hour, the trees thinned, revealing a stretch of open rock near the summit. Megan dropped her pack and motioned for the others to rest. The view, or what was left of it, was surreal. The fire stretched across the valley like a living beast, its tendrils glowing in orange and red veins. It was both beautiful and horrifying. Jenkins coughed violently. His lips were pale, his forehead slick with sweat. Megan knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Weak, erratic. She poured a little water into his mouth. "Don't waste it," he croaked. "Drink," she ordered. "You're no good to me dead." He managed a faint grin. "You talk like a sergeant. Guess I had a good teacher." She stood and walked to the edge of the rock, scanning the skies. No helicopters. No sound except the wind. She tried the radio again. Static. She adjusted the antenna, tapping the battery compartment. Then barely audible came a whisper of a voice. "Control. Fire perimeter breached. Anyone copy?" Her heart leapt. She pressed the transmit button. "This is Hilltop Volunteer 5 survivors on the northern ridge. Repeat, 5 survivors requesting air evac." Static swallowed the rest. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on." Then the voice cut through again clear for just a second. "Signal weak. Need visual marker." "Visual marker," she repeated under her breath. Her eyes scanned the ridge until she spotted a metal canister sticking out of Alvarez's pack of smoke grenade. She grabbed it, twisted off the cap, and hurled it skyward. It burst into a thick column of red smoke, swirling upward. For a moment, hope flared as bright as the signal. Then a gust of wind snatched it away, scattering it into nothing. Alvarez sank to his knees. "We're done. They'll never see us through this." Megan refused to believe it. "They'll see us," she said firmly. "We'll make sure they do." She pulled a small mirror from her medic kit part of a first aid signaling set and used it to flash light through the smoke toward the open sky. The sunlight reflected off it in rhythmic pulses, a distress pattern she'd learned years ago during field training. But the light barely pierced the haze. A roar echoed behind them, a fresh wall of fire climbing the ridge, moving faster than before. Jenkins looked up weakly. "It's circling us." Megan spun, scanning the slopes. He was right. The flames had split into two advancing fronts, curling around from both sides like jaws closing. "There's no way down," Alvarez said quietly. Megan's mind raced. No way down. No way out. The fire would swallow the ridge within minutes. Unless she turned toward the east slope. It was steep, nearly vertical, but dotted with rock shelves. Below it, she could see a small clearing, maybe a dried stream, shielded by rock walls. If they could reach it, the rocks might block the worst of the fire's heat. "That's our way," she said, pointing. Alvarez stared at the drop. "You're insane." "That's a cliff." "It's a chance," she said. "That's more than we have here." No one argued after that. They tied what rope they had, mostly bandages and straps from their gear, and began the slow, terrifying descent. The smoke made it hard to see, and the rock was hot to the touch. Each foothold could crumble without warning. Megan went first, anchoring herself and guiding the others down one by one. Jenkins slipped once, screaming as his bad arm hit the wall, but Megan caught the rope and steadied him, her muscles trembling from the strain. "Almost there," she gasped, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. At last, they reached the bottom of a shallow rocky basin, with barely enough space for all five of them. The heat was still brutal, but it was bearable compared to the inferno above. Megan collapsed against the rock, her skin slick with sweat and soot. Around her, the soldiers slumped, gasping, coughing, too exhausted to speak. For a long moment, no one said a word. The sound of fire filled the silence, crackling, rumbling, alive. Finally, Dorsey whispered, "We're trapped, aren't we?" Megan didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the blazing ridge, the sky above it glowing red. "We're alive," she said quietly. "That's what matters." Jenkins gave a rough laugh. "Alive. For now." She looked at each of them, their burned faces, blistered hands, hollow eyes. They were soldiers, but in that moment, they looked like children lost in a nightmare. And she realized something. They weren't just her responsibility anymore. They were her squad. She sat up, forcing her voice steady. "Listen to me. We're not dying here. I don't care if I have to climb that mountain again. I'll find a way to get a signal out." Alvarez stared at her, eyes weary but full of respect. "You're something else, Carter." She smiled faintly. "Don't tell the colonel. He still thinks I just babysit." Even in the chaos, that earned a few tired chuckles. The flames raged above them, lighting the sky like dawn. The wind screamed across the ridge. But deep in that rocky hollow, 5 survivors clung to a sliver of hope. And somewhere in the haze above, a faint sound began to echo, distant, rhythmic, unmistakable. Rotor blades. Megan's eyes widened. They're out there, she whispered. Hope flared again, fragile but fierce. Tomorrow, she would make them see. The babysitter wasn't done fighting yet. The sound came faint at first, like the heartbeat of the sky, a distant thump, rhythmic and growing. Megan froze, her head tilting upward. The soldiers around her went silent, straining to listen. Then it came again, unmistakable this time. The chopping rhythm of helicopter blades slicing through smoke. Do you hear that? Dorsey gasped, eyes wide. I hear it, Megan replied, pushing herself to her feet despite the burning in her muscles. They're looking for survivors. Alvarez tried to stand, but nearly fell back. They won't see us through this fog. Not unless we give them something to look at. Megan's mind raced. They were trapped in a rocky basin, surrounded by smoke so thick it swallowed the light. The red flare had burned out hours ago, and the radio signal was weak. But somewhere above, a rescue chopper was circling, close enough that she could almost feel the vibration in her chest. She looked around the small hollow, her eyes scanning for anything usable. Then she spotted it. Jenkins's torn jacket, half burned but still recognizable, lying near the rock. Jenkins, she said quickly, you still got those painkillers? He blinked in confusion. Yeah. Why? I need the empty pack. And your lighter. He handed them over without question. She emptied the small plastic wrapper, filled it with scraps of dry cloth, and doused it with a splash from the first aid alcohol. What are you doing? Alvarez asked. Making a signal, she said, sparking a lighter. The improvised torch ignited instantly, sending a narrow column of dark smoke upward. The wind tried to snuff it out, but she shielded it with her body, crouched low, waving the smoke toward the sky. It wasn't much, just a flicker in a storm, but it was something. Above, the sound of the helicopter grew louder. Megan grabbed the mirror again, angling it toward the faint sunlight bleeding through the haze. She flashed it upward in desperate rhythm. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the universal SOS. Come on, she whispered. See us, please see us. The helicopter circled closer. The roar of the rotors shook the air, whipping the smoke into spirals. I think they saw it. Dorsey shouted, pointing toward a faint beam of light cutting through the haze, the chopper's searchlight. Megan's heart leapt. Wave anything you can. She yelled. Jackets, arms, whatever. The soldiers obeyed, shouting and waving their arms despite the exhaustion. The beam passed over them once, twice, then locked in. They've got us. Alvarez cried. A voice crackled faintly through the radio, clearer this time. Rescue 1 to ground team, visual confirmed. Hold your position. Repeat, hold position. The relief that swept through the group was overwhelming. Jenkins started laughing, a raw, disbelieving sound. Dorsey fell to his knees, tears streaking through the soot on his face. But Megan didn't celebrate. Not yet. She knew what came next. The helicopter couldn't land in the basin. The fire still raged on both sides of the ridge, and the air currents were unstable. The best they could hope for was an airlift, and even that would be dangerous in the choking smoke. Hold your position, she repeated under her breath, glancing at the ridge above. They can't reach us down here. We have to move up to that flat stretch we saw earlier. Alvarez followed her gaze. That's through the fire. I know. Jenkins shook his head weakly. We'll never make it. Megan looked at him, her eyes steady. You made it this far, didn't you? No one argued. She helped each of them to their feet, tightening the makeshift bandages, checking the ropes. The fire above had calmed slightly. The wind had shifted, driving the flames west. It was the only window they'd get. Let's move, she ordered. Stay low, Follow my lead, and if you can't run, crawl. We're not dying here. The climb back up was worse than before. The ground burned beneath their boots, and the air was so thick with ash that every breath felt like swallowing sand. The heat pressed on them from all sides, blinding and suffocating. Megan led the way, half crawling, half climbing, her lungs screaming for air. She kept glancing upward. The helicopter was still there, hovering somewhere in the smoke. Halfway up, a burning tree crashed nearby, spraying sparks across the slope. Dorsey yelped as his sleeve caught fire, but Megan was already on him, smothering the flames with her bare hands. The pain shot through her palms, but she didn't flinch. "You good?" she shouted over the roar. He nodded shakily, tears cutting lines through the soot on his face. "Then move." They kept going, step after agonizing step, until the smoke began to thin. The top of the ridge loomed ahead, a pale, jagged outline against the burning sky. Finally, they stumbled onto the plateau. Megan collapsed to her knees, coughing violently. Around her, the soldiers fell one by one, gasping for air. The helicopter appeared moments later, emerging from the haze like a ghost. Its rotors sent ripples of wind sweeping across the hilltop. A voice shouted through the loudspeaker, "Stay clear." Lowering rescue line. A metal cable uncoiled from the chopper, swinging toward them. Alvarez grabbed it first, helping Jenkins clip himself in. "You go first," Megan yelled. "Not a chance." Jenkins shouted back. "You got us this far, Carter. You're going." But she shook her head. "I'm last. Always last." The soldiers didn't argue long. One by one, they were hoisted into the sky. Jenkins, Dorsey, Alvarez, disappearing into the safety of the chopper. When the last of them was lifted, Megan looked around the hilltop. The fire had returned, licking at the rocks. The world around her was an inferno. She grabbed the cable, locking it to her harness. "Let's go," she said quietly. The winch began to lift. Her feet left the ground. For a moment, she was suspended above the flames, the fire roaring beneath her like a living thing trying to drag her back. The heat scorched her legs, and sparks stung her skin, but she kept her eyes on the chopper above, on the faces leaning out, shouting her name. Halfway up, a violent gust of wind hit. The helicopter jerked sideways, and the cable swung violently, slamming her against a rock wall. Pain exploded in her shoulder. The harness strap slipped. "Megan!" Alvarez shouted from above. She gritted her teeth, trying to hold on. The metal burned her hands. The ground below blurred through the smoke, a swirling mass of flame and debris. Her grip faltered. For a terrifying second, she felt herself falling. Then, just as her strength gave out, another hand grabbed the cable from above. Jenkins, his arm still bandaged, his face pale with effort, reached out and caught her wrist. "Not today, babysitter," he yelled. "Not today." With a final heave, he pulled her up onto the landing step. The crew grabbed her, dragging her inside as the helicopter banked away from the ridge. The hilltop disappeared beneath a wave of fire. Megan collapsed onto the floor, coughing, shaking, unable to speak. The others crowded around her, cheering weakly, some laughing, some crying. Alvarez clasped her hand. "You saved us," he said simply. "All of us." She looked up, eyes glassy with exhaustion. "Just doing my job." He smiled. "You're no babysitter, Carter." Outside the window, the flames shrank as the chopper climbed higher, the inferno fading into a sea of smoke and shadow. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The nightmare was over. Or so she thought. When Megan Carter opened her eyes, the world was white. Not the blinding white of smoke and ash, but the soft white of hospital sheets, sunlight spilling through sheer curtains, and the faint antiseptic scent of recovery. Her body ached from every direction, wrapped in bandages that felt like armor. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Only the roar of the fire, the screams, the cable jerking, and Jenkins's voice shouting, "Not today, babysitter." Then the door opened. Sergeant Alvarez stepped in, his arm in a sling, but his posture straight. His face broke into a smile when he saw her awake. "Well, look who finally decided to join the living." Megan tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. He handed her a cup of water. "You've been out for almost 2 days," he said. "Smoke inhalation. Burns on your hands. Some bruised ribs. The docs say you're lucky." She swallowed the water, wincing. "The others? They're alive. All of them." Alvarez's tone softened. "You did it, Carter. You got us out." She exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over her. "Good," Alvarez chuckled. "Good? That's all you've got to say? You dragged 4 half-dead soldiers up a mountain in a firestorm, waved down a helicopter with a mirror, and got us all home. You're a damn legend." Megan gave a weak smile. "Legends don't have blisters this bad." "Yeah, well, legends don't usually work at daycare either." That made her laugh, a hoarse, painful laugh, but genuine. After Alvarez left, the room was quiet again. Megan stared out the window, watching the sunlight shift across the wall. For the first time since the fire, she was still. And in the stillness hid the weight, the exhaustion, the shock, the surreal truth that she was alive when she shouldn't be. A nurse came in later, smiling kindly. "You've got visitors, Miss Carter, lots of them." She wasn't exaggerating. Within hours, her small hospital room became a revolving door of officials, reporters, and military personnel. The story had spread faster than the wildfire itself. "Civilian babysitter saves U.S. soldiers in California blaze." They called her the Angel on the Hill. News anchors replayed footage of the rescue helicopter on loop. Politicians issued statements of gratitude. The families of the soldiers sent flowers and handwritten letters. And then came the ceremony. 2 weeks later, Megan stood in front of a crowd at a military base outside San Diego, her arms still wrapped and her palms covered with gauze. Cameras flashed like starlight. Behind her, the American flag rippled in the ocean breeze. A colonel, tall, stoic, his chest lined with medals, stood at the podium. When disaster struck, when chaos reigned and the world seemed to burn, one civilian refused to run. Megan Carter, a childcare volunteer and first aid worker, displayed extraordinary courage under conditions no one could have survived. She risked everything to save soldiers trapped behind enemy fire, not in war, but in the war of nature. He turned to her and saluted. "On behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, we award you the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal." Applause thundered. Cameras clicked. The medal's cool metal touched her burned skin, and for a second, she felt its weight more than its honor. After the ceremony, people swarmed her with questions. What went through your mind when the fire surrounded you? Did you ever think about giving up? How does it feel to be called a hero? She gave the same quiet answers every time. "I just did what I could." But inside, the word hero didn't sit right. She remembered Dorsey's terrified face, Jenkins screaming when his arm broke, the sound of the forest collapsing around them, the fear, the smell, the silence after each roar. That wasn't heroism. That was survival. That night, when the reporters left and the base went quiet, she sat alone in her barracks. The medal lay on the bed beside her, a perfect circle of gold that reflected the faint light from the window. She traced the edge with her fingers, feeling the ridges press against her bandages. Someone knocked softly. It was Jenkins. His arm was in a more permanent cast now, but he grinned like nothing could keep him down. "Hey, babysitter." She smiled faintly. "You really have to stop calling me that." "Not a chance. That's your call sign now." He stepped inside, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You holding up?" "I should be," she said. "Everyone keeps telling me I'm a hero." "Feels strange." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, you think being called a hero makes it easier to sleep? It doesn't. I've got medals too, you know. They don't make the nightmares go away." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. He shrugged. "You saved us. That's a fact. Doesn't mean it was pretty. Doesn't mean it was easy. But you did it anyway. That's what matters." For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to really breathe. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the night outside. "Jenkins," she said finally, "when they called me a babysitter that day, I hated it. I thought they were mocking me." He smirked. "We were. At first, I figured." She laughed softly. "But now, maybe it's not so bad. Babysitters protect people who can't protect themselves, right?" "Yeah," Jenkins said. "And sometimes they save soldiers too." When he left, Megan lay back on the bed, staring at the medal once more. She still didn't feel like a hero, but she did feel something else. Peace. The next morning, she went home. Back to the quiet hills of Riverside, to the small daycare where it had all started. The children didn't care about medals or news headlines. They just ran to her, shouting her name, hugging her legs, their laughter pure and bright. One of them, little Sarah, the shy one with freckles, tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Megan, did you really fight a dragon?" Megan smiled. "Something like that." That afternoon, as the children napped and sunlight streamed through the windows, Megan sat by the window and looked out at the distant mountains, blackened now, scarred, but still standing. She thought about that ridge, about the fire that had nearly taken everything, and about the men who now called her family. The news would forget her eventually. The medal would gather dust. But those 4 lives, those faces she'd carried through the smoke, they would never fade. She didn't need parades or applause. She just needed to know that when it mattered, she hadn't run. She had stayed. And maybe that was enough. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Megan whispered to herself, almost a prayer. "Just a babysitter, huh?" She smiled. Not anymore. The weeks after the ceremony blurred together like smoke, thick, hazy, impossible to grasp. Megan Carter returned to her quiet life in Riverside, but everything felt different now. At the daycare, the children's laughter still filled the halls, but sometimes, in the middle of story time, she would drift away. A sudden sound, the hum of a lawnmower, the hiss of boiling water, could send her spiraling back into the fire. The roar of flames, the choking air, the scream of breaking trees. At night, she dreamed of the hill. Always the same dream, the ridge blazing red beneath her feet, the rope slipping through her burned hands, the endless climb through smoke. She would wake up gasping, heart pounding, hands trembling. She told no one. When the news first broke, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists wanted interviews. Podcasters wanted her story. Morning shows offered flights to New York. But after the medal ceremony, Megan stopped answering. The world had already moved on to the next story. Another storm, another tragedy. The headlines faded, and that was fine with her. She tried to bury herself in routine. Diaper changes, nap schedules, arts and crafts. But sometimes, as she bent down to tie a child's shoe, she'd notice her own hands, still scarred, the skin thick and pale where the fire had kissed it. Her doctor called it healing. To her, it felt like a reminder. One afternoon, she drove out to the hills. The forest had changed. Blackened trunks stood like sentinels, silent and charred. But tiny shoots of green were pushing through the ash. Life returning. She parked near the trailhead and stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. For the first time since the fire, she let herself cry, not out of pain or fear, but release. "Megan?" She turned. Jenkins stood a few feet away, dressed in civilian clothes, his arm out of the cast, but still stiff. He smiled when she met his eyes. "I figured I'd find you here," he said softly. She wiped her face. "How do you know?" He shrugged. "This is where it all happened. You think any of us can stay away for long?" They stood in silence for a moment, staring at the hills. The land was scarred, yes, but the air smelled cleaner than she remembered. The wind carried something lighter, a promise that even after fire, the earth learns to breathe again. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "You ever get tired of people calling you a hero?" She gave a faint laugh. "Every day. Me too." He chuckled. "My mom's got my face on her fridge like I saved the president or something." "You kind of did." "Yeah, maybe. But you," he looked at her, his voice softening. "You saved us. I don't think you understand what that means." "I don't want to," she said honestly. "Because if I think about it too much, I'll start wondering why I made it and others didn't." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Survivor's guilt. We all get it." They walked together along the edge of the burned trail. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, the kind of quiet shared by people who had already faced death together. He handed her a small envelope. "Before you ask, it's not another medal. Just a letter." She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note, written in uneven handwriting. "To the lady who saved my dad. Thank you. He said you were braver than any superhero. Ben, age 8. Megan's throat tightened. "Ben? Dorsey's kid," Jenkins said. "He wanted you to have that." She smiled through the tears. "Tell him I said thanks." "I already did." He grinned. "He said he wants to meet you someday. The real babysitter soldier, he called you." They laughed at that, the sound carried away by the wind. As they reached the top of a small ridge, Megan looked out at the horizon. The sunlight spilled across the hills, touching the blackened ground with gold. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't felt since the fire: peace. Not the absence of pain, but acceptance. "You ever think about what's next?" Jenkins asked. She smiled faintly. "I think about it all the time." "You should come speak at the academy sometime," he said. "Tell your story. You'd make a hell of a training instructor." "Me? Teach soldiers? Why not?" "You already did." She laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe, but I like my daycare kids. They're easier to handle." "Until snack time?" he teased. They both laughed again. That night, back at home, Megan sat at her kitchen table with a letter in front of her. The words glowed softly under the lamp. Braver than any superhero. She thought about Ben, a child who almost lost his father. About Dorsey, Alvarez, Jenkins, men who now lived because of one choice she made to stay. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe what everyone had been saying. Maybe she really had been brave. Not fearless, never that, but brave enough to keep going when fear wanted to stop her. In the weeks that followed, she started volunteering at wildfire safety workshops, teaching people how to prepare, how to stay calm, how to save lives. At first, she only helped with logistics. But soon, the coordinators asked her to speak. The first time she stood before the crowd, firefighters, rescue workers, local volunteers, her hands trembled. She wasn't used to being the center of attention anymore. But then she remembered the ridge, the smoke, The mirror flashes through the haze. And she spoke. Not about glory, not about medals, but about moments, the small human choices that separate fear from courage. When she finished, there was silence, and then applause that felt different. Not for a hero, but for a survivor who had found her way through fire and come back with something to share. Afterward, a young firefighter approached her. "Ma'am," he said nervously, "I was on standby that day. I couldn't reach your ridge. I thought you were gone." She smiled gently. "So did I." He hesitated. "You're the reason I joined full-time. I figured if a babysitter could do that, I had no excuse." Megan blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. When she returned home that evening, she placed the letter from Ben beside her medal. Two symbols of the same thing, courage recognized not by rank or ribbons, but by gratitude. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in fiery orange streaks. The color used to make her flinch. Now it made her smile. Fire wasn't just destruction. It was also renewal. And she, too, was learning to grow again. As night fell, she whispered to the dark, "Maybe I was just a babysitter." But that day, that was enough. She turned off the light, the faint gleam of her medal reflecting the last glow of dusk. A quiet reminder that sometimes the bravest battles are the ones fought after the flames. Years later, Megan Carter would look back on that ridge and feel no fear. Not the kind that made her knees buckle or her lungs burn. Not the kind that clawed at her in the dark. Those memories still whispered in the corners of her mind, but they no longer controlled her. The hills outside Riverside had begun to heal, just as she had. Green shoots now pushed through the blackened earth, bending toward sunlight. Birds returned, cautious but persistent. Life was stubborn, and so was she. It started quietly, with small gestures. Megan began speaking to local schools about wildfire safety, showing children how to identify danger, how to act calmly, and how to help others in moments of crisis. She never mentioned her heroics, only the lessons she had learned. Courage was quiet. Bravery wasn't about medals. It was about staying, even when leaving seemed easier. Parents started calling her the teacher who could save the world, though she smiled and said no such thing. Then she received letters, thousands of them, from children, from parents, from soldiers she'd never met, inspired by the story of a civilian who refused to leave. They wrote about courage, hope, survival, and kindness. One letter stood out. It came from a boy named Ben, now 9 years old, handwriting growing steadier, the words clumsy but full of heart. "Dear Megan, I told my friends you were the bravest person ever. My dad says every time he tells the story, he remembers how lucky he was. I hope one day I can be half as brave as you." She smiled softly, placing the letter beside her medal and the photographs of Echo Squad. Word of her story spread across the country. She was invited to conferences, workshops, and safety seminars. Journalists occasionally remembered to call, but Megan had grown wiser. She spoke only when she could teach, when her words could help someone else survive the impossible. One spring, she received an unexpected visitor at her home. Sergeant Alvarez, older now, his face lined with years of service, stepped onto her porch with a small box in hand. "You don't get many visitors," she teased, motioning him inside. "I wanted to give you this in person," he said. "It's from the squad. We thought it was time." Inside the box were small, intricate carvings. Each soldier had sculpted something symbolic. A rock representing the ridge, a tree scarred by fire, a miniature helicopter. Together, they formed a miniature replica of the ridge where Megan had saved them. "I'm speechless," Megan said, her voice thick. "I don't know what to say." Alvarez smiled. "Say nothing. Just know you changed our lives. Not because of medals or praise, but because you stayed when it mattered most. That afternoon, they walked along the hills, sharing stories, laughing softly at memories of fear and triumph. Megan realized then that legacy wasn't something the world gave you. It was what you left behind in the hearts of those whose lives you touched. Months later, she was invited to Washington, D.C., to speak at a National Disaster Preparedness Summit. She took the podium, the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal pinned to her jacket, but she didn't focus on herself. Instead, she told stories of courage she had witnessed, not just her own, but of firefighters, children, soldiers, and civilians who had faced danger with unwavering determination. And sometimes, she said quietly, courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. It tells you to stay, to help, to carry on. And when you do, lives can change. Sometimes one person's choice can tip the scale between despair and hope. The audience was silent. Some cried. Some nodded, wide-eyed, absorbing the truth in her words. Back home, she continued her work. She taught safety courses, created programs for children, and mentored volunteers. The daycare remained her anchor. The laughter of children, their trust, and their curiosity grounded her, reminded her that ordinary days could carry extraordinary meaning. Then, one afternoon, a helicopter landed on the field outside the daycare. Megan approached cautiously, expecting journalists or officials. Instead, it was Echo Squad, Alvarez, Jenkins, Dorsey, now fully recovered, in civilian clothes, grinning like boys who had returned from battle but never truly aged. We wanted to thank you, Alvarez said simply, handing her a small folded flag. For all of it. For staying. For saving us. Tears pricked her eyes. You don't have to thank me. You're alive. That's thanks enough. Jenkins laughed. We're persistent like that. And you're not getting rid of us anymore. They sat together, sharing a quiet picnic on the grass. Megan watched their faces, now lined with experience and life, and felt a profound sense of closure. The hill no longer haunted her. It belonged to them all, to survival, to courage, to life. Even the local news picked up the story. But this time, Megan didn't feel a rush of anxiety. The world could talk, but her life was hers. The quiet smiles of the children, the letters from grateful strangers, the returned soldiers, that was her audience, and it was enough. Later that evening, she walked alone to the edge of the hills, looking back at the distant ridge where it had all begun. The scars of fire were still visible, but nature was reclaiming the land. Life always does. Megan knelt, pressing her hands to the cool earth, whispering a silent promise. I will not forget, and I will keep living. The wind brushed against her face. Somewhere above, a hawk circled, indifferent to human history, yet witness to courage. She smiled faintly, feeling the warmth of the sunset, the resilience of the land, and the quiet strength she had found within herself. She thought of the ridge, the fire, the smoke, the rope, the helicopter. She thought of fear, of pain, of every trembling step she had taken to save the men she now considered family. And she knew something fundamental, that courage was not about glory, medals, or recognition. It was about showing up, choosing to stay, choosing to act when it mattered most. She stood, brushing ash from her clothes. The ridge looked calm now, serene, even inviting, a reminder that life continues, and scars heal, and every person has the capacity to rise when faced with impossible odds. Megan walked back toward the small town, toward the children waiting for her, toward life that had not paused for heroism, but had continued, awaiting her return. And in the quiet of the hills, under the glow of the setting sun, she whispered once more, not for anyone else, but for herself. Just a babysitter on the hill? Maybe. But that day, I chose to stay. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world. The wind rustled the trees in agreement. The hills remembered. And the legacy of the ridge, the courage of one ordinary woman in extraordinary circumstances, endured.